DNA, but like I know a fellow, believe it or not, this sounds like a fish story, but it's not. This guy I know, he's a Mexican resident, very capable international businessman type guy, known him for years. He got somehow stem cells to treat a really rugged form of diabetes, knocked it dead in its tracks.
Wow, that's awesome.
And, of course, there's such a financial industry here relative to the diabetes industry between the meters and the insulin and the this and that. And it's hard to get something really through. But for all that sass, this guy promised us that if he hadn't had this stem cell therapy, he'd be dead as a hammer. And he eats pies and everything else. He's perfectly in good shape in that context. So what I'm saying is verifying what you're saying. This ostensible race from wherever doesn't need our DNA, no.
Well, it goes even further than that, because when you look historically at these beings, whether it's the Naga in India and Tibet, or whether it's the dragon folk in China and in Japan, the Dragon King under the sea, or the fairy folk in England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the Holdras in Scandinavia, they have an overwhelming interest in all the folklore and first-hand accounts, an overwhelming interest in human reproduction, in obtaining human beings for breeding purposes. It is the main theme, whether it's the frog princess or the frog prince or the Rumpelstiltskin who wants the baby for its genetic diversity potential. It's always something to do with reproduction and youth and seducing a maiden, seducing a young man, these types of things, and abducting people. This is not something new that just these so-called aliens have come up with. This is something that these same beings, and that's who they are, they're the same beings in my opinion, something they've been doing all along. Such a species could not possibly originate far away. No matter what level of technology, they would have to be genetically related even to successfully do any gene splicing, for instance. In other words,
you would think so. They have to. William, we're just about need to take a break here. Our first break, it's about a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll come right back, and we've got a lot of interesting stuff to cover. So we'll be right back. Well, it's good to be back with William Mott. We've got a lot to discuss. I mean, the folklore that exists is so striking and so strange and yet so verifiable that this can't be a mistake. As we discussed in the first half hour, this dragon thing it seems to be replete all through different civilizations, from England to China. Now, this cannot be just an example of just people telling tall tales. People so far divergent in time and civilization, and they're not getting all their stories matched up. And what's also weird, William, is there's no dragon carcasses we found anywhere. I mean, what the heck? It still strikes me very strange.
That's true, and obviously, there's the human psyche has a lot of archetypal imagery locked in it. Dragons and things like this are associated with mysteries, longevity, all types of things like this. But it's interesting how many UFO encounters, for instance, time and time again, going back for decades, people describe some of these beings as wearing an insignia, even whether it's the little gray guys or the ones that look more human, or even entirely different, more or less humanoid types. They'll have an insignia on their uniform, and more often than not, it's a winged serpent. It's a serpent with its tail in its mouth. It's what looks like a dragon. This is something that happens again and again. And so
it's always struck me, the serpent thing, the dragon thing, but the serpent thing in a general nature, it's just bizarre. And of course, the devil's, always alluded to as being a serpent in the Bible.
Exactly.
And it's just really bizarre.
Well, here's something interesting for you. I believe in Hebrew that the term is nagash. That's the term in Genesis that's used to describe the serpent in the Bible. He walked upright at first when he came to Eve. He was not made to go on his belly, whatever that actually means, until after he had done his dirty deed, and whatever you want to think that was. But he originally he walked upright, the nagash, It said he was the most subtle, or in other words, the most clever beast. And by saying beast, then that means it's not a human being. You know, so you have that term, but you know, on the Indian subcontinent, these same types of beings are called naga, which also means cobra. But it's also used to refer to these humanoids of some sort of reptilian descent or affiliation. And so it's awfully interesting. And by the way, you have the nagual in Central America, which is basically the same thing.
So there's all kinds of repeated examples of it.
Yes, it just goes on. And you know, it's nothing new. And as you said, you know, it is associated, for instance, with the devil, as are flying shenanigans. For instance, you know, Christ called Satan the prince of the powers of the air. You know, in many Old Testament books, you find reference to these. Like in the book of Zechariah, I think it's the 3rd chapter. It talks about it. What basically, if you get the correct translation, it's a flying cylinder of silver. And you know, Zechariah asks actually a messenger from God, you know, what is this thing that we see? What is this? You know, it's so strange. And he says, this is the curse that goes back and forth over the whole earth. So, you know, this is a very ancient mystery. It's nothing new. These guys are not coming from Alpha Centauri. You know, Occam's razor certainly would indicate that the simplest answer is usually the correct answer. So if there's a group here that for a long time have been keeping us in the dark, convincing us that they come from far away, and that makes it much easier for them to live here. It makes it much easier for them to do whatever they want to, because if you think they came from far, far away, then where are you going to go to put a stop to it?
You know, but then again, I'm not trying to be the devil's advocate here, but with all the modern surveillance, like we were talking about a minute ago, that we do have, why wouldn't we spy these things?
Who's to say we haven't?
Well, I can't say we haven't. You got that right. We don't know most of what's going on. That's true.
You know, that's all I'll say about that. I would suspect that we know more, you know, that such governmental agencies know more about this than they let on. And I guess the question is, what can they do about it, and what will they do about it? And so.
Well, I don't know. I mean, they may or they may not. I know. You know, okay. So my brother, of course, he used a lowly sonarman. He wasn't involved in any top secret clearances or anything like that. And all they would say to him is, "Yeah, Doug, we see him all the time. Just mark it down," or something like that. I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, the astronauts have. Well, I remember I've read an account that Buzz Aldrin was told by LBJ himself back in the day to just keep his mouth shut and don't tell the reporters about the UFO things, and that was that, and you just didn't. And so, yes, I presume if they saw some lizardy old alien that they might be told to shut up about that too.
Right. And understand that, you know, there's a lot here in terms of social continuity. They worry about societal upheaval, I'm sure. You know, so much has been lost, for instance, in the various religious traditions. Unfortunately, the Judeo-Christian tradition has lost a lot of the knowledge and the interpretations of things, the proper context that used to exist. You know, it's kind of like how, you know, that there's certain things that they study, but then they don't put a lot of emphasis, for instance, on, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, you know, because it's basically a love poem. It's pretty explicit, and it's biracial. So you don't hear a lot about that in Sunday school. But, you know, at the same time, there are other things that they lose because they just don't want to talk about it. Genesis chapter 6 is the perfect example, of course, which talks about the pre-cataclysmic world when the Watchers came down and they interbred with human women. It says they took them, the ones they wanted. In other words, it didn't say that they came and said, "Hey, you want to go out on a date?" They took what they wanted, which sounds suspiciously like UFO accounts today, with abductions and so forth, and you know, and of course they had hybrid offspring, who were very unpleasant. And if you read, for instance, the apocryphal books of Enoch, which the book of Enoch is one that Christ quotes from, half of the Epistle of Jude is directly quoted from the earlier book of Enoch. You know, these guys wouldn't have quoted from that book if they didn't think it was scriptural. Period.
Right. Sure.
Why else would they quote from it? But that book tells Book of Enoch, Jubilees, Jasher, which are all referred to in the Bible, but then they took them out. They say, as it was written in the book of Jasher, as it says in the book of Jubilees, and then it's not there because it bothered people. Because it talks about these beings. Call them whatever you want to. Call them fallen angels. Call them, aliens, whatever. But obviously, a fallen angelic being, for instance, would be an extraterrestrial by any definition, because it's not from Earth. But these beings, cosmic beings, whatever you want to call them, they have an interest in humanity, and it's kind of an unsavory one. For genetic usage, for genetic exploitation, and they always have had this attitude toward us.
I hate to seem like a dumb as a post, but why would you figure they'd need us for genetic mutation or sexual outlets or whatever? I mean, I understand that, right, as we discussed, they wouldn't need us for gene therapy, but
it depends on which tradition you look at, but the answers are often very similar. For instance, in the Judeo-Christian, actually in the Judaic tradition, these beings wanted the watchers, the 200 watchers were assigned, and this ties in with a lot of conspiracy theories now that you see about the moon, for instance, there's more and more of them all the time about ruins on the moon and stuff like this. They were assigned to an outpost on the moon, and their job was to watch over the human race. And this was not the original fall of Satan and his angels. This was a different group. And they became so enamored of what they saw going on down here that they wanted some. And they kind of made the assumption that, well, we'll go down on shore leave and we'll be forgiven.
Right.
Well, they did, and they weren't. It's kind of like watching the kindergarten and then doing bad things for the kids. Yeah. And so once this happened and they realized that they could not return to their former state, they decided, well, if we can't have what we have, we're going to make the best of what we have here. Basically, setting themselves up as gods, interbreeding with women and trying to set their own offspring up. But the problem is their offspring, like any type of hybrid offspring, their offspring have fertility problems. And the overall message seemed to be that they had to have a steady influx of human genetic material in order to continue to exist in a physical form. The ancient Hebrew tradition calls the souls of these beings, once they die, the hybrid beings, they call them dibbuks, or unclean spirits. We call them demons. Okay, demons are not fallen angels in the traditional view. In the actual traditional view, demons are not fallen angels. Fallen angels are their fathers. Demons are the millions of dead hybrid beings who were destroyed in the cataclysm that we recall as the flood.
I see.
And so their spirits wander because since they're half human, but they're also half fallen angel, or whatever you want to call it extraterrestrial if you want to. I mean, it's all a matter of interpretation. But their spirit can have no rest because supposedly they have no possibility of salvation on the day of judgment. And so they're just miserable beings, and they wander around trying to find a human host to inhabit. And if they can't inhabit it, they want to make you as miserable as possible. That's the actual view of demonology from the Judaic point of view. And these beings, their lust for the sensual, once they came down here, they became so enamored of sensual things, of fleshly desires, things like this, because previously they could not experience this, and they were never designed, whatever they are, they were never designed to experience it. So they really can't handle it. It's kind of like people that don't have the ability to metabolize alcohol. Well, they become the worst alcoholics.
Yeah, they sure do. That's a fact.
It's the same sort of thing, I think, and so this is very much what is described, in the Book of Jasher, Jubilees, the books of Enoch, and several other apocryphal books, and it's referred to in Genesis chapter 6, and also it's in Numbers, where it talks about these beings after the flood, because, in chapter 6 it says there were giants in the earth. Actually, the translation is Nephilim, as you probably know, fallen ones. There were fallen ones in the earth in those days and also after that, which in those days would be the flood, the pre-flood days, and after that would be after the flood. So then after the flood, again, you find the people having to come into conflict with beings like Goliath and his brothers, who are, again, described as descended from a group called Anak, the sons of Anak, who are giants in the book of Numbers. And they are cannibals. And it says that where they live, it says the land devours all who enter. People don't understand about the so-called genocide, that supposedly went on when the Jews went into, or the Israelites went into their new land. Well, it's because the beings that were there would not tolerate any other type of person unless it was in a subservient or even a cannibalized role. So,
right.
People don't have the context when they make these assumptions about a lot of these ancient books. They need to find the other things that were taken out and find out what it really refers to.
Well, the giant thing is an interesting thing. Stephen Quayle is an author that also writes a lot about that. But separate from Quayle, like the situation with the reptiles, it seems like every culture's got tales of giants. The American Indians did.
Right.
Weren't there even, I may be off base, I think I read this somewhere, it's been a while, don't they have really outsized suits of armor in England?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all around the world they found gigantic armor, swords, but more than that, they found the bones of some of these beings. Almost invariably, somebody shows up and says, "Hey, we're from this government agency. We're from the museum, this and such an institution."
I'd heard that. That they put the
grabs on
some of them.
We want to borrow these. We'll bring them back, and of course, you never see them again.
Right.
Often these giant skeletons that are found, and listeners can look up something called the Lovelock skulls and the Lovelock skeletons, the Lovelock giants. Yeah. Okay. This is one group that fortunately was photographed, or parts of them were photographed before they disappeared. In Lovelock, Nevada, I believe it was. But oftentimes they have red hair, or the remnants of red hair. They have double rows of teeth. They'll have multiple digits. In other words, they'll have 6 fingers and 6 toes on their hands and feet. And if you read, for instance, in the Old Testament, Goliath is described as having 6 fingers on his hands. And if you study in the folklore of ancient Europe, you'll find that trolls and other large man-eating cannibalistic humanoids are described as having double rows of teeth. Sometimes they'll have horns, as some of these actual skeletons have been found.
Oh, they've actually had horns on the skeleton?
Oh, yes. And in fact, there's some photos of some in my book, some of these skulls with horns. Yeah.
Are there any that you could go see, like hop a plane and go see these skeletons, or are they?
No, I don't. No, not. I really don't know. I know that photos have been taken and even appeared in magazines and newspapers of the day, and it says, so and so from the Smithsonian Institution. Whoop, there I went. Smithsonian showed up and borrowed them, and borrowed these skeletons for research, and said, and then you never see them again. It's kind of like the Indiana Jones thing, where you got a big warehouse somewhere, I guess, and you stuff everything that doesn't fit the paradigm into its box and put it on a shelf somewhere. But
for those that are skeptical, I could just say this, the listening audience: there's even stuff on a more prosaic level that's not as threatening that the government still has secrets, like from World War One. I mean, in logic would say, who the heck would care what transpired during World War One? Make it public. What's the difference? Yet they still hold on to it. So something that would be inflammatory, like something like this, I can appreciate that they would hold it as secret.
Right.
I really can.
And you have to ask what this is all about. Whenever you have a cover up like this on any matter, there's the old saying that knowledge is power.
Right.
And you want to control the knowledge, you want to control the narrative, and so forth, if you want to stay in power. So, if people knew some of these things, what would be if society at large came to accept these things, what would happen? Unfortunately, religious institutions might collapse or be majorly redefined. A lot of things might happen. But for instance, and I'm talking a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition, but my book talks about all religious traditions around the world and their interpretation of these things. But in that
particular, I don't really have any conflict with it in Catholicism. I mean, there's demons and all this, and demons don't come with owner's manuals as far as as far as what form they could take, and in other words, it's basically a mystery to Catholicism. So in other words, to have interplay with mankind would not be necessarily threatening or.
Well, I think that these beings are generally, they're either going to be indifferent or they're going to be malicious. I think that should be and approach with extreme caution, because simply that's the track record with such things.
Oh yes, all these are negative.
And for the interesting thing about this that kind of ties this together, you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a scroll found a few decades back, one of the last ones that was really found. It was called the Book of Giants. And it was found, it's an Essene scroll that was found.
Okay. And
which, of course, is a Jewish sect, the same group that, gave us a lot of these other Dead Sea Scrolls, or pretty much all of them. And in the Book of Giants, it's the account of what happened when Enoch approached these beings. And these beings are described as being of two types. There's the giants, who are the direct sons of fallen angels, who have set themselves up like gods and emperors on earth and rule over the rest of us mere mortals, and do so with great cruelty and violence. And there's another group of beings which it calls the translation is the monsters. And what these beings are is they're a genetic hybridization, as described also in the books of Enoch and Jasher. They're hybrids of humans, of Nephilim, the fallen ones, and of animals. And some of them have animal characteristics.
Yes. Well, there's chimeras like the jackal-headed beast that was associated with Egyptian
centaurs, satyrs, all these types of things described in these ancient belief systems. And Enoch came and he said, "Look, I've been told that you are all going to be destroyed. There's no," and they wanted a pardon. And he said, you're not supposed to exist, and you've done a lot of really evil things to humanity, and you're going to be wiped out. And so their leader pleads with Enoch once again to go, and plead their case before, the cataclysm is basically, that's going to be their punishment. And the interesting thing about this is the leader's name of the giants, like the ruler of all these demigods. His name is Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh.
Oh, yes, I remember that name.
But see, the thing is, Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh is the name of a demigod character in the oldest written account ever found, called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you hear the story about this guy his father was a god, his mother was a mortal woman. And he's a mighty man, just like the Bible says, in Genesis chapter 6, a mighty man of renown. He's basically like a Hercules, part God, part human. Right. And he wants to live forever like his father. He realizes that he's as smart as his father, he's powerful, he's physically powerful, but he will die someday. And he goes on a quest to try to find immortality. And one of the places he actually goes to talk to his to those who are, the ones he would go to for information, his relatives, is in the underworld, which is very interesting. Also, he also fails. He is mortal, and that's all there is to it. This is a Sumerian account. And, of course, the Hebrew people came from, Abram came out of Ur, which was a Sumerian city. So originally that's where they came from. And so, this Essene scroll names the leader of these Nephilim giants as Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh, and it ties it all together. And see, this is something that you're not going to learn about in Sunday school.
No, I agree. That's true. You've pieced together some things I was somewhat familiar with, not entirely, but somewhat. This is some fascinating topical material. Well, we're just about ready for our second and last break. But William, how did you come to be interested in this particular material? I mean, you've done a good job with researching it, but I mean, what led you to this?
Well, my whole life I was an avid reader, You know, from an early age, of course, all types of fiction, and you know, pulp fiction and science fiction and fantasy and classical fiction. But also I had a strong interest in history, religions, folklore, mythology, comparative mythology, things like this, and Fortean pursuits. I can remember being, you know, like about 8 years old and finding a copy of Frank Edwards' book, Strangely Enough, with a big eyeball floating over what looked like the surface of the moon. And, you know, it's little short true accounts or allegedly true accounts of these anomalous stories. And so I was, you know, into all this stuff from an early age. And finally, you know, I kind of, it was all in there kind of stewing around together. And when the 90s rolled around and I saw a lot of the almost panicked interpretations of things that people were seeing and experiencing, because there was a lot of activity in the 90s. And people were just basically freaking out, and they were trying to just come up with any explanation they could think of. And I had been stewing on this stuff for quite a while, and so I decided maybe it was time to sit down and look at this logically, and look at the patterns and the parallels, and try to find a logical explanation for most of this stuff.
Well, you've sure done a great job. I'd go ahead and tell the folks how to get your book and where to get it, and then we'll take our last break, and we'll come on back and might ask you a few questions about leprechauns. That's
okay. Well, that sounds good. I appreciate it. My website is mottimorphic.com, 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 and there are links to all of my books there. If you click on the book cover, it will take you to the authorized publisher, not the ones that are trying to rip me off, which would be much appreciated. And you can go to my authorized publisher. The books are of highest quality and the most up-to-date editions, and they cost less than people who try to rip you off. So, yeah, so people can check it out there, and they can get the books in print and in digital formats, and pretty much, I think, just about every digital format is available.
Well, that sounds good. I urge everybody to do it. Well, let's go ahead and take our